rage goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles. That's the opening line to Homer's 3,000-year-old epic, The Iliad. The poem focuses on the tragic events of the Trojan War, where the Greeks fight to take back Helen from Troy. Achilles is the main character. He's said to be the best of the Greeks, one of the most amazing and greatest mythological warriors of all time. And standing beside him all along is his beloved companion, Patroclus. What many people may not know is that hidden in this epic tale about war is a tragic queer love story. Whether or not they were romantic, it's a big topic of debate, but many modern scholars say the secret about them is now out. One of them is New York Times best-selling author Madeline Miller. She wrote the popular novel, The Song of Achilles. In it, she explains how Achilles and Patroclus end up together in love and in war. We're going to dive into it with her today in Gay History with Tom Ranzweiler. Madeline Miller, thank you so much for being here. I'm so thrilled you're here.
It is such a pleasure. I am really, really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
For anyone who is not familiar with the Iliad or your work, The Song of Achilles, can you just give us the top lines on Achilles and Patroclus and their relationship?
Sure. So, there are going to be some spoilers here for the Iliad, so I apologize about that. But in the Iliad kicks off in sort of the last year of the Trojan War with a huge blowout fight between Achilles and Agamemnon. They're both on the Greek side. Agamemnon is the overgeneral of the Greek forces. And the fight sort of boils down a little bit to Achilles saying, "You're not the boss of me," to Agamemnon. But Achilles then sort of, in order to prove to Agamemnon how valuable he is, says, "I'm not going to fight for you anymore." And then, see how you like that, see what happens then. And he goes storming off to his town. And what we see sort of in the next sort of development of the Iliad is we see that Achilles starts to, we see a little bit of Achilles and Patroclus, and we see that they're this incredibly deep bond, but we don't really see anything about that bond. We hear that Patroclus is Achilles' most beloved companion. But we don't really see, he's just always kind of there in the background with whatever Achilles is doing, but we don't really learn about him. Now, meanwhile, Achilles' plan is working, the Greeks are losing, the Trojans are winning, and the Greeks want him to come fight again. And they come to Achilles and they say, "Will you fight for us?" And, push back the Trojans, they're about to break into the camp, and he says, "No, I'm not going to fight." And so the Trojans keep winning and things get very desperate for the Greeks. The Trojans actually break into the Greek camp and they're about to burn the ships, which is a huge disaster for the Greeks because for 10 years they've been camped out on the shores of Troy and they've been invaders. But as soon as their ships are burned, they're going to be refugees. And sort of into this moment, this character who's only been in the background, Patroclus, steps forward. And Patroclus says, "Let me put on your armor, Achilles. I know you don't want to fight. You're having this pride thing with Agamemnon, but let me put on your armor and I'll go out and I'll pretend to be you and I'll push the Trojan soldiers back." And Achilles agrees. So Patroclus puts on Achilles' armor, goes out to fight. And when he's out there, he ends up sort of getting overcome with this excitement of battle, and he ends up going all the way to the walls of the city, and here comes a spoiler, he is eventually killed. And this is really the moment that I find so interesting because there's so many things, there's so many ways to shape the story of Achilles, to talk about. It's a story of rage. That's the first line of the Iliad, "Sing goddess of the rage of Achilles." And oftentimes when people talk about his rage, they talk about his rage towards Agamemnon. But this is really the turning point of the Iliad right here, Patroclus' death. Because when Achilles finds out that Patroclus is dead, it's like a bomb goes off in his life. He is just overwhelmed with grief and rage and pain. And that's really the moment where he decides to start fighting. He keeps telling us, "Nothing will make me fight again. The most important thing is my reputation. Agamemnon has offended my reputation. Until he makes reparation, I'm not going to fight." But as soon as Patroclus is dead, that's all gone. It turns out there is something more important to him than his reputation. So that was really the moment that drew me to that story. The fact that, who is this man that means so much to Achilles, more than really anything else? But why do we see so little of him in the Iliad?
Homer doesn't explicitly spell out in the Iliad that these two are in any sort of homosexual relationship. He doesn't go there. But like you said, it's like a bomb went off in his life
Yep.
when Patroclus dies. So
Yes.
it's almost like, how else can you interpret it?
Exactly. And, this is a poem that is about grief and loss. There's so many people grieving. And yet, even within that, Achilles' grief stands out. It's really, to me, the only reading that makes sense. And I can remember reading the Iliad in translation in high school and sort of feeling like, I feel like there's something missing here. I don't know, something's not, not feeling right. And then I began to realize when I headed off to college that there's this whole background of interpreting them as lovers and sort of their relationship as being this intensely romantic entwined relationship, that was a totally normal interpretation of their relationship in the ancient world. The ancients, either way, you would hear people talking. For example, Plato writes about them being not just lovers but ideal lovers. And then you do have other people who dissent and say no, they were the closest of companions. But either way, their relationship is primary to the Iliad, and their love for each other, which in my opinion, I think makes the most sense as romantic love, is really the linchpin of the entire Iliad.
So really the interpretation of Achilles as a historical figure through the lens of Homer and the Iliad, it's more about how we're looking at him almost as a culture, right? So as we move forward as a culture, as the LGBT rights movement grows bigger and becomes more accepted, we're more open to interpreting the character of Achilles as almost like an LGBT figure.
Yes, exactly. And this is not a stretch at all, as I said, in the ancient world. The ancient, that would have been a very, very common interpretation. And you mentioned that Homer at no point says that they were lovers. And sort of the basic argument about that is, Homer never says that they were lovers because they weren't, or Homer never says that they were lovers because it would have been completely obvious to everyone in the ancient world that they were. And so, that's the sort of thing that we can't really quite get back to. What is the context for the people who were experiencing it back then? All we can look at is various other people responding to it, like Plato. There's a fragment of a lost Aeschylus tragedy that features Achilles mourning over Patroclus's body and talking about their frequent kisses. So all we know is that later authors interpreted them as lovers.
That's fascinating to me. The gossip, the controversy wasn't about Achilles and Patroclus being lovers. And in my research, I found that the gossip was more about who was on top and who was on bottom. That to me is wild. And was that something that you had to like delicately approach or dance around when you came to writing your book?
Well, it's so interesting because I'm always asking myself, and you're particularly referencing an argument that happens in Plato's Symposium, where they're sort of looking at, I mean, what's amazing is that the ancient Greek world, we oftentimes talk about it as being sort of one unified thing. But the ancient Greek world was very, very diverse depending on what city states you were in. And almost all the authors whose voices we have are aristocratic males. So we are looking sort of through the ancient world, like through a pinhole. So we always have to take sort of how Plato is, writing about these things as, he's just one person of his place, of his time. But yes, I mean, what was funny is that he's looking at, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were composed, 400 years plus or minus before. And he's saying that, well, according to the standards of, Athenian society at the time, the younger man is beautiful, and he's the one who's being mentored by the older man. Well, Achilles is the most beautiful, so he must be the younger man. But wait a minute, the older man is the one with all the power, and Achilles has all the power, so he must be the older man. But wait a minute. And so what's amazing is that, you can see sort of later generations wrestling with it as they're trying to kind of apply their own ideas about how these relationships should be onto Homer, who's, doing his own thing, if Homer even was a person.
And, and that's like a total different, that's a whole nother conversation, Homer, because
Yes.
who was he? or how many people were he?
Right, exactly. And but your point is so well taken. I'm sorry, that's my cat behind me.
I love it.
What you are describing is absolutely right, which is that there was no argument over, gasp, oh my gosh, were they together? That's such a controversial statement. It wasn't at all. It was on what is the nature of that relationship, given that, a whole chunk of the literary world is imagining that in fact they were together.
I know, you have that big epic in 2004, the movie Troy comes out, right? And they portray these two, I believe, as cousins in it. And I remember watching it, and I remember looking at, Brad Pitt's Achilles and thinking, I love my cousin, but this would not have been my reaction. So then, fast forward a decade and your book comes out, and I'm like, oh my God, this interpretation of this story makes so much more sense to me, especially as a gay male. And I want to read just a little bit of something you wrote in your story that kind of chokes me up even now. And you write, this is Patroclus talking about Achilles. He says, I could recognize him by touch alone, by smell. I would know him blind by the way his breaths came and his feet struck the earth. I would know him in death at the end of the world. You've studied these two characters. You are so in their heads, which as much as you can be in the heads of someone who, is a part of mythology from 3,000 years ago. But what is it about the personalities of Achilles and Patroclus that creates this magnetism between them?
One of the things that I'm with you on the cousin thing, by the way. But one of the things that I found really, really engaging about Patroclus is that I love to write really close to the material. And so I did a deep dive on the Iliad and all the sort of versions of his story that are out there. And there are a couple of descriptions of him in the Iliad that are really quite arresting. And one of them comes from Briseis. Achilles is not the only character who mourns over Patroclus's death. There's also an enslaved woman whose name is Briseis who delivers this beautiful eulogy over his body. And she says of him, you were always gentle, which is a really unusual description for an ancient Greek hero. And then that idea sort of gets repeated in a line by Menelaus, who's the king of Sparta and the husband of Helen, when he is trying to get all the Greeks to fight to save Patroclus's body and to sort of bring the body of Patroclus back to Achilles. And he's like, come on, Greeks, fight for Patroclus. He was kind to everyone. And again, that was just a really stunning moment, because normally in the ancient Greek world, what you would say about heroes is he sacked a lot of cities and he had a lot of gold and he threw big parties. And, you would say things that were much more about sort of their martial prowess. But you have two very different characters here speaking to kindness and to gentleness in Patroclus. And so really he started to stand out for me as this really unusual figure in the world of the Trojan War, and a very admirable person. And that I sort of thought that, to me, that seemed it must relate to his bond to Achilles, is that he really stands outside of the war in in some way that really pulls Achilles to him. And Achilles himself is a very interesting figure, because although he fights and he is, the best of the Greeks and this powerful warrior, he's also an incredible doctor and healer and an incredible musician. And so you always sort of feel like that Achilles had these other paths out there for him, where he could have been, another Orpheus, or he could have been another Asclepius. And to me, I also felt like there was this deep bond for these two men who really grew up together.
It reads almost like a modern, gay love affair. It's not like you're looking back, again, 3,000 years ago, because there were moments in this book that, like Achilles and Patroclus, like you were saying, discovering themselves as they were growing up and discovering themselves almost in a very secretive way, like they have to hide away. And then you also have the character Thetis, who's doing everything to protect her son Achilles, but also could be read almost like the mother-in-law from hell, which is another thing I have, very nearly experienced. So I'm reading this, and I'm like, oh my God, this, you could just change these names and change the settings, and it's almost like you have just a modern love story, but just through a homosexual lens. Mm-hmm. Did you face any pushback from anybody, whether it be, in the classical community, in the book publishing community, who said, listen, Madeline, don't publish this book as two gay lovers. It's not going to be successful.
You know what, I really worried that I would face that kind of pushback. And I got some, I not worry in the sense of it was going to stop me at all. Because part of the reason that I really wanted to write the novel is because I felt that this version of the story of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers, with the love story at the center, had really been kind of forcibly closeted by the academy, by classicists, by the culture at large. And I was really frustrated and honestly angry. And I wanted to deliberately kind of explode that. And I want to say, actually, I think the story makes the most sense as a love story, and make that argument. But I was quite worried that there would be some pushback. And I can remember my classics mentor, my most beloved professor, Michael Putnam, I had sent him the book finally when it was finished. I actually hadn't let him know I was working on it at all. It was completely finished. I sent it to him and I called him up and I said, I've mailed you this novel I wrote. It's about Achilles and Patroclus. And he said, well, I certainly hope you made them lovers. And just, I was like, oh, how wonderful. And you know, what I realized is that classicists, you know, the secret is out among classicists. I mean, I think classicists know about, you know, that this is a long-standing interpretation. And I found a lot of support there. And I can honestly count on one hand the number of negative messages I've received about it. So I'm thrilled that, you know, I'm thrilled that the world is changing for the better in that way.
Do you think their story was kind of hijacked by, patriarchy, whether it be in the classical community or just in society?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think it was the type of thing where, you know, you knew if you got deep enough into Plato, but it it was sort of, uh, you know, it wasn't talked about. It was just, you know, it was the old, oh, they were close friends. You know, they were war comrades, they were companions. And it isn't that close friends, you know, it isn't that those can't be important bonds too, but it was definitely the type of thing that clearly people were afraid of. But what's interesting to me is that it keeps kind of popping up. Actually, there's references to it in Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. And I hear you're going to be possibly writing about or talking about Shakespeare later, and his own relationship to sort of queer texts and queer narratives. And so I'm not surprised that it does pop up. And the other Greeks are kind of responding to Achilles and Patroclus as if they're a couple, but it's both, they're kind of razzing them, but it's also, they also accept it as sort of, so it's very interesting. I feel like Shakespeare is kind of also doing this interesting dance around their relationship. So as much as it's been pushed down, I also feel like you see it kind of pop up, that people, that if you know, you know,
Yeah.
you know. But of course, I mean, it has been rewritten so many times where, you know, Achilles is in love with this princess and he's in love with this princess. And, you know, the focus has been on his relationship with Briseis and sort of writing about that, which has its own problems. Not only is it sort of erasing any possible connection with Patroclus, but also, you know, she's an enslaved woman. So how consensual is this relationship, you know, if you're going to go in that direction? So I feel like it's interesting to see how people have tried to rewrite the romance around Achilles' life in general.
And the translation there is extremely important, right? Like the way people are translating these texts, like down to the word, is really, really important. I think you reviewed Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which was just like out of this world for me. Just so to see like more of this being told through the lens of not just a straight white man is, just mind blowing.
Yes, and so important. I mean, what's amazing is that, you know, one scholar making a call to sort of use this anesthetizing word that covers things up can then make a huge difference on generations who are reading that translation and thinking that that's, you know, the truth. So I think it's really important to interrogate how we've received these texts and sort of what the translations are that are out there, and kind of really dig into that. What you're alluding to with Emily Wilson is her talking about how the term for slaves often gets translated in the Odyssey as something like maids, which is really something quite different from slaves. And if you're reading a scene about maids, it feels like a much less disturbing scene than if you're reading about enslaved women. I mean, the scene is disturbing no matter what, but it really gets to another level. So yes, so important to go back and really question, you know, not only to dig into the original text, but to dig into how they've been handed down to us and the ways that they've been sort of pushed or pulled out of shape in order to, you know, conform to modern ideas, modern patriarchal ideas.
In your book, you have Achilles say, name one hero who was happy. And he says he's going to be the first. At the end of the day, do you believe Achilles was happy?
You know, there is this scene that I was really inspired by in the Odyssey, where Odysseus calls the spirits out of the underworld. And when he calls them out, he sees Achilles and Patroclus is there with him. So on one level, it is happy. The two of them are together. They're reunited. We don't see Achilles lost in his endless grief the way we see him at the end of the Odyssey. I'm sorry, at the end of the Iliad. But at the same time, Odysseus says to Achilles, here you are, you have everything you wanted, you're king of the dead, you're the most famous warrior that have ever lived, it must be pretty good. And Achilles says, no, it's better to be no one than to be king of the dead. I made the wrong choice. And that scene was with me as I was writing the whole thing, because I'm there with Patroclus, who's rooting for him to make a different choice, but also willing to be with him on this sort of terrible choice that he's made. But I wanted my Achilles to both find tremendous happiness, but also to really have some big regrets. But those regrets are mitigated by the fact that he is with Patroclus at the end. And some of this is that all these sort of things are very complicated, because even though he has this really powerful sort of haven of his relationship with Patroclus, he's very drawn into this kind of toxic masculinity world of Agamemnon and competition and honor, and he resists it actually a fair amount. He's much less cruel, and this is true both in the Iliad and I represent this in the novel, than a lot of the other heroes around him. But he certainly gets pulled into that, and I wanted it to feel a little bit like a poison that's seeping into his life. And he's been raised to think that he's famous and golden and extraordinary, and it can be very hard, particularly as a teenager, if that's the expectation you've been raised with, to let that go. And so part of what I always felt looking at his story is this incredible tragedy of being so young. Achilles is really so young when he's asked to make that choice, and he's so young when he goes to war, and just letting the pathos of someone who's asked to make a choice, an impossible choice, too young, and then has to live with that choice.
Just to think about this story that we perceive through generations, and I was taught in school to be a story about war, and to realize that this is a story not just about war. It's a tragic love story that still, thousands of years later are pulling on the heartstrings of people around the world. And thank you for capturing that in such a beautiful way.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I know you did Circe, which is another amazing novel. I just want to say it's just so good, and anyone should check that out too. What's next for you? I think we're all just kind of waiting with bated breath.
Well, my other sort of thing that I love is I love Shakespeare. And actually I came to write Song of Achilles because I directed a production of Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which made me decide to write the novel and also to become a Shakespeare director. So there's one Shakespeare play that I really don't enjoy directing at all, which is The Tempest. So that's the one I'd like to write about.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm really looking forward to grabbing that one. And I thank you again so much for being here and doing this with us.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.